In this episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast, I'm joined by Tina West, Executive Vice President with SRG Residential. When we first came up with the idea of launching a podcast, Tina was one of the very first voices I reached out to join me. Since then, she's had a lot of change professionally, something we dive into during the podcast, and relate to the leadership development model in multifamily. We also dove into how multifamily could learn from the hospitality model in both service and staffing. It's a great conversation that really centers around the most important P in multifamily, people. And with that, let's get to the show. So first and foremost, thank you for joining me. But as I warned you in advance, I was going to tease you a little bit in the beginning. When we first launched the idea for Multifamily Talks, I had a list of folks in my head that like, oh yeah, I want to go talk to those people. And this was, I don't know, 9-10 months ago. And you were on that list. Like I reached out to you way back then and we did finally connect and you connect in there, but there's been a little bit of transition in your life since then. So why don't you give a little bit of background about, where you've been that transition. And then I kind of want to talk about how that's just kind of a part of multifamily and how you help lead others through it, but I'll let you jump into it.
Sure. Well, Andrew, I was really just trying to keep you on your toes and see if you could find me and how bad you really wanted to talk to me. I chased you down. Well, I could tease you back and say you're just as hard to get on the calendar, but
true, very true.
Anywho, glad that we're finally having the chat. And yes, it's interesting. We talk about hindsight, right? Like hindsight's 20/20, and that's for a reason because if we knew always what was in front of us, right, then maybe life would be a little bit more boring. But yeah, it had some unexpected change. It wasn't change I was looking for. I've learned, though, in my 35 years in this industry and in life in general, that change is inevitable. And, it's why the book Who Moved My Cheese was written, right? Yeah. Because I don't know about you, but I'm a creature of habit. I also may like to have control. So when change happens, I think, we sometimes feel out of control. We fear the unknown, but it's inevitable. So it's part of life. More often than not, I would say we get to look in the rearview mirror and go, wow, that was a blessing or that was for my good. But yeah, it had some change and I'm in a new chapter and frankly, loving it, enjoying it. And I think there's a lot that it takes to get somebody to get to the point of okay, I'm here, I'm accepting it. And now let's just make it the best.
Yeah. So it's interesting. One of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you, I take it back. One of the reasons I did reach out to you as one of the early ones is, on LinkedIn and social media, you have a very positive presence that has a lot of focus on team development, leadership development, really self-development more than anything else. And when all this change was happening, I started to reflect and realize, I didn't realize then, but I was reflecting on how much of career advancement within especially multifamily management involves some pretty massive changes. As I was talking with you, they don't build you a bigger, better building next door. So as a leader of people within multifamily, how do you help people go through that change? What are the things that you focus in on? How do you lead teams both inside an organization, but also so often between organizations as careers develop?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gosh, there's a lot to unpack in that question. So I would say, first of all, change as it relates to this industry, right? I think, again, it's also inevitable. You've got mergers, acquisitions, sales, transitions, right? All of these things that happen. Sometimes we see it coming. Sometimes we want it to happen. Other times we're just one day we get an announcement and something's happened, right? Or we want to make a change because we want to pursue that dream, right? That next path. And so sometimes change is, I think, created, right? Like something you want to pursue. And other times change happens at us or to us. And I think it really boils down to a mindset, either path, whether it's, something you wanted or something that happened to you or, a situation that occurred. It starts with that mindset, and it starts, I think, with accepting the path forward. If it's a career path that you want to pursue, I think there's a lot of acceptance and really self diagnosis of like, okay, what do I want? How bad do I want it? How do I get there? What's it going to take? Am I all in to make that happen? And so as a leader and a coach, when I talk to my teams, because my favorite thing to do is help people achieve their dreams. Like that's why I get excited and passionate, because for me, there's nothing better than having a team member say like, hey, I wanted to, be here, do that, accomplish this. And like, you helped me forge the path, or you helped me wrap my arms around it, right? I get a lot of requests for mentorship. And I think it really starts with like that self-discovery of, okay, like, again, what do I want? What does that look like? How do I get there? And then helping somebody just navigate the headspace around that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I didn't know we were going to go down this path, but I so want to keep going down this path. It's really interesting. First question for you on that, when it comes to really enjoying the ability of seeing others flourish and finding that next step for them, has that something that has been innate in you? Is that something that you learned over time in the industry, or is that something you've intentionally cultivated? Or all three?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I actually haven't thought about it that way, but I will say early on in my career as a leader, like any first time leader, there's a lot of stumbling. There's a lot of, mistakes made, things that you do that you're like, oh gosh, like what was I thinking? And I don't think that until I, became better, stronger, more mature leader, that I started to be more aware and more intentional, right? And or it's, the experience of having had somebody say, oh my gosh, look at, I've arrived, or, I've accomplished this, and that feeling, right? That first time you're like, wow, that was awesome. I want to do more of that, right? So I think leadership growth happens over time. And I think the more you are in a position of leadership, the more you mature, the more you experience and grow from your own mistakes. And also you get to experience more of those victories, more of those celebrations. And then it becomes more intentional, right? And I think it's less about, and I think too, just time spent in an industry or in a position, like, it's not about me so much anymore, right? It's about them. And I think it's that shift from like me, early in your career when you've got like this ambition, and now, I still have a ton of ambition, but frankly, like I've done a lot of great things. I've been very blessed, and it's not about me, it's about my team. But then that kind of comes back to you, and rewards you in a way that, you kind of get a little bit of that me back, but it wasn't intentional. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And, as you were going through this, there's a couple different questions that popped in, and one of which I will get to in a little bit is kind of how we think about this in a potentially changing operational model. And you and I have talked about this a little bit of, the trends towards centralization or specialization and whatnot. But before we go there, you mentioned mindset, I think at least 3 times in that. And that means different things to different people. But what's kind of your process for making sure you've got the right mindset? And then probably more importantly, what's that process, and how do you pass that process down to the leaders you're developing, that next level where you're measuring your success now?
Yeah, well, in full transparency, like the mindset doesn't always start in a very good way.
Sure.
Frankly, when I was sort of hit with this massive career change that I wasn't expecting, reorgs and such, I was not in a good headspace, right? Like I didn't see it coming. I didn't want it to, life was good. And so my initial reaction was like most people, right? There's some shock, there's some, like digestion, there's some anger, there's all the emotions. And so you have to kind of work through that. I will say I have had a business coach, a career coach who is now one of my closest friends, but she's been with me for over 25 years. She's usually my first call outside of my husband, to kind of help me break it down, because I think sometimes by ourselves, it's the stories we tell ourselves, right? And most of those stories are fiction, not fact. So, until you're like really self-aware and good at breaking down the fact from fiction, you usually need somebody to help you with that, right? To kind of help break it down, clear your head. So I say I always start there, and get somebody a coach, a friend, a husband, a spouse, whoever it is for you, have somebody to help you kind of like be there for you to help process it. It's when you start kind of processing and breaking it down and understanding like what's the worst thing that could happen, and you go down that, okay, and then what, and then what, and then what, and then you get to the end of it and you're like, gosh, you know what, that's like not so bad, right? But when I started, I was like, woo, all the crazy, the worst case scenario, right? And sometimes you get to that point finally where that worst case scenario isn't so bad. And then you can get your mindset right? Because if you don't go into anything or anything you go into that where you don't have that right mindset, you're probably not going to achieve that end result or goal that you want to. So that's what I mean about mindset. It's about, getting to that place where you've got clarity of mind, clarity of purpose, clarity of path. And then also acknowledging that chances are what you think or know today is probably going to change tomorrow. And so you've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We hear that all the time,
Yep.
right? And it means a lot of different things, but like expect that things are going to change, look different, plan for that. And then I think you can start to manage that headspace a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's something that is a really, really positive way that society has advanced is, you mentioned you had a business coach for 25 years. 25 years ago, yes, I'm old enough to remember being in the workplace 25 years, that long as well, that I would imagine that was almost seen as possibly even a weakness. Like that, you weren't the one who could just tough it out and strengthen out, and you're just going to muscle your way through everything, which is kind of what it was when I was first coming up and growing up. Like you might have found a mentor, but to truly go out and find a coach that you were going to go to, I love that that's changed, and I hear that more and more. And I'll echo. I was going through a recent challenge. It wasn't really a challenge; it was a really decision, and I just had the passage of find wise counsel. Find wise counsel, and find those folks that you truly trust and are willing to have those hard conversations, and being able to humble yourself to be able to just listen. And
that's so true. I think you're right. I think then, right, it used to be that when someone got a coach, it was often prescribed, right?
Yes.
That, hey, you know what I mean? We're going to get you a coach because you need to work on you. And it's interesting. That actually wasn't how it came about for me. This was actually somebody who was doing some consulting, loved all that she did. And I'm like, will you be my business coach? And I will say to you, her job is not easy. I am, not necessarily the easiest. What was it, a coachee, a mentee? I don't know what you want to call me, but I'm hard work. So, it took time for me to hear the words and not be defensive. But I will tell you, 25 years later, it didn't take 25 years, but along the course, what I knew was this: her sole motivation was my success. And knowing that she had no ulterior motives, there was no benefit, you know what I mean? She wasn't trying to, take my job or, get me to, she truly just wanted me to be successful. And when any person, any relationship, right, in life, when you know that their sole motivation is your success or your benefit, you trust them. And so I trust her implicitly. I can hear the words. I still don't like a lot of the words. I'll still be like, no way. And, I still have denial, but at the end of the day, it's that ability to hear the words that you need to hear, to take it in and then do something with it. That's how you get better, right? That's how you get stronger. That's how you become a better leader, teammate, whatever it is that you want to apply that to.
I didn't know we are going to have a therapy session and go down this coaching path, but I'm loving it. It's the great thing about podcasts. You just have a conversation. So I guess going back to the leadership in multifamily, and again, a huge part of what I see of you from your outside is kind of passing that same approach to others. I see you doing it to the broad masses on LinkedIn. I have to imagine that's also a part of your team as well. So what are some of the steps you might suggest to maybe that mid-level leader that's out there right now who's looking to take that next step to truly put all of their not responsibility, all of the way they measure success as, am I raising the success of others up? What would you give as a recommendation? And then I kind of want to switch the conversation and go towards like where operating models are going in multifamily.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, when I think about teams that I've had over the years, you've got to be coachable. So it starts there, right? So if you're the leader or the mentee, like you've got to be coachable. And I think it boils down to really just having regular cadence check-ins and conversations around, how am I doing? Here's where I want to go. Like, this is my big audacious goal, right? Here's my dream. Like, here's where I want to be in 5 years, 10 years, next year. And then as their leader, be willing to give them very open, honest feedback. I think there's still too much fear and timidity around sharing transparent feedback. I think there is still this misnomer that communication is bad. Versus it being, healthy and a good thing, right? For two people to have a conversation and communication around feedback, around goals, around check-ins, like, hey, let's check in. I don't want to wait a year to have a formal performance appraisal with somebody and you'd be like, wow, I had no idea. And now here we are a year later, right? It's that regular cadence check-in. It's that regular ongoing feedback, both directions. It's the team member or the associate asking like, hey, how am I doing? Like, am I doing what you want me to do? Like, I mean, I will often ask my leader, like, am I in my lane? Am I out of my lane? Like, especially right now, I'm in a new position formally than I've been. And even though I've done this job for years
Sure.
in some way or another, like it's a new formal role. And I'm like, am I in my lane? Like, have I gone in, someone else's lane? Like, tell me, am I doing what you want me to do? Like, so it's me wanting to hear the feedback and then being open to having, he or she say, you know what, like, here's what you're doing well, but here's for you to get to that next level. Like, here are the things that you should really focus on. I call those opportunities. And when you have that ongoing open dialogue, again, it's about building the trust. It's about, having a team member, be like, hey, that was hard to hear, but like, I know you want me to be better. I know you want me to better my best. And so like, I can hear it and I'm going to work on that. And trust is the foundation. Trust, communication, right?
Yeah, as you're saying all that, I kept rolling in my head like, yeah, reading radical candor is relatively easy. Putting radical candor into practice is actually really hard when you first start doing. Because I know, like, I'll ask you towards the end what the one book you'd recommend is, and that one's been recommended a couple times on the podcast. Like I said, and it's great to read it, and you can see the quadrant and everything else, but actually doing it sometimes is not quite as easy as reading it.
100%.
So let's talk about how to start applying this, because one of the things that I'm seeing happening in multifamily is there is a shift in the operational model that a lot of groups have been leveraging, and a lot of groups are trying to think about how that shift would apply to their organization, and whether you want to call that shift centralization, specialization, role specialization, there's a bazillion words for it. I guess number one, I'd love to get your take on how you and your organization are thinking about it or are not thinking about it. And then we can kind of talk about what kind of maybe the bigger impacts and how you might think about handling them are. But how are you guys thinking about that overall process of changing the operation model?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, when I think centralization, I think really the primary goal behind what we call centralization is efficiencies, right? Yes. I think, so really it's more about efficiencies. And I think owner operators, like they were the first, because they could roll out what we might call centralization, right? They were able to pull, more resources into the corporate office, right? And centralize some of those routine, I want to say mundane, but the routine tasks, right? Where things you could do remotely, screening, go down, payables, receivables, right? But as a third party operator, which has been, the majority of my last years, we don't have the same benefit, or I say benefit, same capability to do that just because of the way that we operate, right? We're a true third party operator. We have lean margins. And so the way that we create efficiencies in third parties is a little bit different, right? We've done podding, for example. We might have an owner with scale where we could pod and share roles across a portfolio. We might have owners with one property that need efficiencies, and so we'll allocate or share staff, right? And so the way that we're trying to create efficiencies is a combination of what I'll call podding, but also it's the technology, right? It's, technology, I think, is really what's created most of this opportunity. So it's, what can you leverage the technology to do so that you can free up your team members to spend more time on the personal side of the business. So, whether that's smart home technology, self-guided tours, building access, remote maintenance, there's a lot of companies that do all of these things, but there's a lot of tools that enable our team members to do less of the, kind of more mundane tasks so that they can really truly focus on what I think matters more, which is, the soft skills, the people side, the relationship, the care. And that, I think, is opening up opportunities for people that are specialized in certain skill sets, or that have, a need for flexible hours, right? Or remote work.
Yeah, there's lots of benefits to it for sure, especially when I talk to owners and operators out there, almost always in this order, although the order flip-flopped recently. The two things that are at the top of mind to them is fraud, number one, and staff retention, number two. Again, 2 years ago, it probably would have been the other way around. It's recently kind of flipped on there. And there's lots of benefits towards obviously the specialization of something like screening, where, you're taking that off, and I kind of laugh when you said the technology was kind of arrived. I'm old enough. I remember having paper ledgers on the property, and the only reason that you could centralize the accounting functionality was because you had the technology that took all of those away. And, that's the other thing that cracks me up. We've been centralizing for 30 years.
It was kind of fun to line it up. I really had to I wanted to have the straightest lines on my ledgers. That was a challenge for me. So we made fun with it, right? We had some fun.
We did. I can tell you also, I was very proud of my leasing agents' boxes because it was in order of the tickle that they should have every time I was done reviewing them. God, it's amazing how far we've come as an industry, quite literally. But one of the things with that specialization model that I've been thinking about, and tell me if I'm crazy on this, honestly, if I'm overthinking this, someone call me out on it. I go back to that leadership development model, and as difficult as it is to go from leasing professional to assistant community manager to community manager, it was pretty replicatable between organizations. And we talked about, that change earlier of jumping one organization and others, you're chasing a career path. And let's be real, that's pretty common in our industry. How, if at all, are you seeing that leadership development platform as it stands is either A, morphing, or B, breaking, or C, supporting it? And Andrew's crazy.
Yeah. So, this would have been back in the late 90s. I remember thinking to myself, gosh, what have we done, to these poor associates of ours that, we promote them to their level of incompetence because, to your point,
I love that sentence.
So we were like, okay, so, you start in leasing, and then, when you're really, really good at leasing, guess what? We're going to promote you to a bookkeeper or assistant manager. And now we've taken our best people and put them in paper positions, and they hate it, right? Yep. Because they're stuck in a room, posting rents, whatever, doing all the things. And now we've totally ruined them. And I remember back at my Monarch days, because we could, we had our own vertical, we were flexible, boutique. And so we wrote tracks, career path tracks that said, look, if you were a really good leasing professional, if you loved sales and people, you don't have to move into an assistant manager role to be promoted. You could be a leasing mentor and then a leasing team leader. And we built a path for people to stay in, the where their skill set, is where it thrives and where they're passionate, and I just kept thinking, gosh, if only as an industry, we could not do this to people, right? We take single site managers the next best, role for them, right? They think is, well, I'm going to be a regional because that's like next in line. Well, single site management and multi-site management are very different,
Yep.
and it's not for everybody. So what I have seen so far with some of the centralized, or efficiency models, is that it offers career pathing in a way that I think is more akin to what I just described, right? So, your leasing team members, they get to focus on sales and retention, right? They're the people side, like the relationship side. They don't have to necessarily, focus on the administrative or the paper side because like technology is doing that, or maybe we have another centralized department that can do that. So I do think it's allowed for some specialties. We talk about, the lease up mindset versus the stabilized mindset. And if you've got a really stellar lease up manager or, leasing team member, you better move them fast when you stabilize because they're going to be bored out of their mind and you're going to lose them if you don't, right? So I think some of this centralization does allow for people to thrive and grow in the areas where they really want to be, versus kind of forcing them into another path or another role.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. It has a great opportunity there, and I see that. And I kind of go back to, again, talk about old history, past, etc. When I first was a leasing manager way back in the day, I worked for an organization that when you got hired as a leasing manager, they were very intentional about telling you your job is to become a community manager. Like that is your job. And of course I was like, what's the fastest anybody's done it? Like I'm going to beat that. Like it's me. But part of that, and what I think organizations need to come back to, I'm just going to get on my bully pulpit at this point, is we had a monthly check-in. Like I said, our property managers were our mentors. We had a monthly check-in where we literally had an assessment across all the skills you would need to be a community manager. And that first year was intentionally, we used to call it moving all your dots to the right. The first dot in the first column on the far left has not had any exposure to this. And it was maintenance and housekeeping and accounting and leasing and all the different things. And you knew you were ready to be a community manager when all of your dots got to the right. And I think for organizations that may have centralized some of these processes, I think they're still better. I think they're very well served if they've got a path where they're still making sure their community managers and at a minimum, their regional managers are still incredibly well-rounded around these functions. Like how do you run a building not knowing the impact of delinquency, even though you're not the one who has to go knock on the door?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
that.
100%. Yeah. I think for sure, you need to be well-rounded. You need to have that cross-training. You need to have that exposure. I think the think like an owner mentality can't really happen if you don't understand the impact of the business, right? I mean, how many times have you heard somebody say, well, I'm just a manager. I'm just a leasing. No, you're running a multi-million-dollar business. So like, let me tell you how that $15 decision applied good old Irv, let's apply the cap rate. So that was actually a much bigger decision times 100 that you make every day. Like this is the impact that you're making. And I do think that we need to spend more time truly educating our site team members. I mean, I think at the regional level, you're exposed a little bit more, right, to the financial impact and the bottom line. But on site, I don't know that our team members really understand the true value of the jobs that they hold and the decisions they make, and the magnitude of the values of the assets that they're managing, right, and impacting.
Yeah, I mean, I call it the most important equation in real estate. Like we I actually, even here at RealPage, I teach it to salespeople. Like you need to understand what this is all about, and that sure that there's NOI, but ultimately affects evaluation. And then the narrative I'm really kind of like leaning into is that valuation is then also providing people's retirements and pension funds and all the other things. This is not just about, the rent at the end of the day. That's a piece of it, but it is so much more up to, and absolutely importantly, providing people homes. Like that's what we get to do every day. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's transition a little bit into one other thing that I think you and I kind of connected on our pre-call. And I'm going to go way back in the conversation when you said, like, when we get to, by specializing some of these roles and taking these more administrative tasks off property that can be taken off property, we allow people to focus more on the resident, on the people, on the human connection. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but I recently read a book that is Unreasonable Hospitality, and it's about the story of the number one restaurant in the world and how they became the number one restaurant in the world. And there were so many things I pulled out of this that I was just like, oh, multifamily could be doing this. Multifamily could be doing this. Multifamily could be doing this. Where do you see, for lack of a better term, where do you see hospitality fitting into, like, Elizabeth, where do you see the hospitality mindset fitting into multifamily today, and where do you think it can go?
Yeah. So now you're going to get me like totally crazy because like this is where I get really excited. I think people don't really understand the difference between hospitality and customer service, right? Hospitality is it's making your guests, your residents, your customer feeling welcome and feeling valued. Customer service is the action, right? It's the response to a question or the solution to a problem. And I think, you can't have hospitality if you don't have great customer service. So I think they're absolutely like they go hand in hand. But I think hospitality 1000% is the answer to differentiation. When you've got 50 properties in a 10-mile radius, they all have the super cool pools and the fitness centers and all the bells and whistles. The differentiation, in my opinion, is going to be through that hospitality-minded approach. It is the difference. It's why, when we think about hospitality, immediately you're thinking Four Seasons, Ritz-Carlton, sometimes you're even thinking like retail, like Nordstrom, right? And you feel good because, you show up at a hotel or at a restaurant, hospitality, right? And, they know your name. If you come back, because what happens when you do hospitality well is that you create loyalty, you create reputation, and you have return business. Yeah. And so, it feels good when I walk into my favorite restaurant or my favorite Nordstrom or my favorite hotel, and they're like, oh my gosh, Mrs. West, welcome back. And they're like, I remembered that, they know something about my life. They know something that I wanted to do. And they really, I call it that anticipatory. It's the Ritz-Carlton. It's the anticipatory behavior. You're anticipating before the customer even knows what they want. That hospitality, that level of service, that level of memorable moment will outshine and cause you to be leaps and bounds above the competition. I'm 100% convinced of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I used to define, I don't know where I heard it, but I used to heard the definition of hospitality is providing for the needs of the guest before the guest ever realizes they're in need. That's and, right. You're giving some high-end brands on that. Like, the Four Seasons, Ritz-Carlton, all these, absolutely. I'm going to give a couple lower-end brands that I think is just as capable. Like Chick-fil-A, I think, does a great job of this. Like, they might not know my name because I don't go in there that often, but I almost always have a positive experience. When
my pleasure.
Yep,
my pleasure.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep. The other one and no one's going to relate to this unless they live in Flower Mound, Texas. There's a local donut shop in Flower Mound where I live, where my boys and I used to go after karate literally almost every Saturday. And they absolutely knew the boys' names. They knew that I wasn't going to order donuts. I was only going to have the coffee. And it was funny because for years, they called my oldest son Mike. His name is Charles. My son liked them so much, he never had the, I don't know if encourage is the wrong word. He never wanted to correct them. Just he was perfectly fine that he was Mike to them. Until one day it slipped out and they were so apologetic, etc. But it was that simply taking care to actually, pay attention and listen on that. So it doesn't have to be the super high dollar.
I was going to just say that, I use those brands just because they're like usually the first things you think of. But I think any company, any brand, any price point can practice hospitality and differentiate. Because again, I go back to, yes, it's that anticipatory level of, expectation service, but it's about making people feel welcome, right? And valued. And it's a mindset. And so when you think about hiring talent, To me, what is one of the most important things is you hire the heart and you train the skill. You can't train that. You can't train the heart, right? You got to hire the heart and you train the skill. So hospitality, it's a mindset. It's a heart set,
Yeah.
I think.
I love that. Again, you've given me another one that I'm not going to let go of. And that's you train the skill. You don't train the heart. So where, I guess in your mind, and I've got one specific example of where as an industry we can be better at doing this. Again, I'm stealing from the book, Unreasonable Hospitality. I highly recommend it. It's a really interesting story, but at a super high-end restaurant that I've never been to and probably never will be at the prices that they charge for being the number one restaurant in the world. But they like give everyone literally a parting gift. So everyone walks away with a parting gift from it. And they have a team of social media researchers that are doing their research on these people before they ever get in there. I am not suggesting we start stalking residents and prospects like that. But think about the move-in gift and how many people are spending $30 to $50 on a move-in gift in the actual thing when it's, paper towels and soaps and toilet papers and all the necessities, right? What if we actually had 4 or 5 canned options that we have, and the leasing professional who actually did the lease with them decides which one is the best one to fit their needs? If they loved the kitchen, they're all about kitchen. What if there's a junior league kitchen package that you put in with the junior league cookbook and a couple of things like that? There's just so many other touch points that we have because we're in people's lives that we can do that I think that there's an opportunity to think about to expand that. Are there any things that jump on? I realize I'm putting you on the spot on this.
No, I think this is great. First, I want to say I'm gonna get the book. I have not read it. I want to, but I'm gonna go like way back.
Yeah.
Ken Blanchard. Everyone can probably remember the 1 Minute Manager.
Yep.
Okay, but he also wrote a book called Raving Fans, and it was his books are easy to read. They're just like tales, right? Fairy, fables,
Yep.
and you read them quick. But he got it so right years and years ago with Raving Fans, which is, in order to get to the +1, okay, because the +1 is what I call that hospitality, the wow, right? You can't do the +1 if you don't do the basics consistently, because nothing will ever feel wow if the basics aren't met. So years and years ago, when that book came out, I read it, and my partners at Monarch Group and I wrote Rating Fans for multifamily. I wrote a Rating Fans program for our industry because I was like, yes, this is the answer. And so, some of the things that we did, and they're so simple, right? But again, we had to have the basics. You had to have a clean environment, right? Like you had to be responsive, like the things that you had to do the minimum in order to do the +1. So one of the things that we would do is each team member would be partnered up with somebody in the maintenance department, and so you had someone in the office and in the field, and they were responsible for their building. Those were their Raving Fans. Their goal was to create customers for life with their building. When it was someone's birthday, they would, handwrite the birthday cards, or they would call them and the team would sing happy birthday. We got to know our customers, right? That's part of it. We would know if somebody got a promotion or was having a baby or lost a job, and, we were there with the flowers or the congrats card. Like, we paid attention to their life. We knew their dogs, and they would come in and have their favorite treats. And you know what? Maybe, Hero the dog liked a different treat than, Sammy the dog. And so we were personal. One of the things that we used to do, 2 things that I thought were really fun. When we knew somebody was coming in for a tour or to move in, like we had our guest parking out front, we actually bought those, like the movie theater, like rope, whatever they're called. Yeah. And we would actually put like their name on it and say, welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So they had a parking spot. It sounds simple, but like when you drive up to a property and your name is like, and you got a front door parking spot, we partnered with the pizza place right next door. And, they knew that if we were going to have 10 or 15 or 20 move-ins a month, like they were going to do their welcome pizza. So most people don't eat when they're moving, they're
Right.
running around, they're tired. So we said, okay, what do you want for lunch? Or do you want it for dinner? This is the menu. Tell us what you want. And we would order it for them and have it delivered to their residence, because it mattered, right? So to your point, absolutely, it's got to be personal. People know when it's like generic and it's like, yeah, everyone gets that. But like, how do you create a memorable moment? How do you do the plus one? It's by getting to know your customer and responding to their needs and their wants and their preferences, right?
Yeah.
That's the plus one.
Yeah, I agree. It is, and you said it a couple of times, and I'm going to reemphasize that it is getting to know the customer, taking the time to actually learn their individuality, which is what makes our industry so unique and so awesome. Is we get an extended time frame to be able to do that. Yeah, you get it relatively quick for a move-in gift, but what about the next 2 to 3 years? Hopefully is on there. Okay, so we're coming up towards the end of our time, and I always ask one guest, or I always get the guest one question. You may have already given the answer out on this one, but we've covered a lot of things from managing change and organizational change and the excitement of hospitality and being able to deliver it. But going way back to mentorship, way back to the beginning. If you could only recommend one book to someone who's coming up in the industry and is looking to do that personal development, what's the one book that you would recommend and why?
Primal Leadership. So Primal Leadership is written by the same group that wrote, How Full is Our Bucket? It's really about, understanding your talents. But this book, I was still pretty young in my leadership, maybe 10 years in. Went on spring break trip, read the book, came back. My coach was like, what did you eat? It just changed my perspective on leadership, the role of leadership, the responsibility of leadership, the partnership between yourself and your teams, and really about what I would call situational leadership versus like there's one size fits all versus no, like your job is to understand your team, what their strengths are, and help carve out a path for them to be successful. So Primal Leadership, I think, everyone's got to read it.
Well, okay, so you got Unreasonable Hospitality on your list. I've got Primal Leadership on mine because it's one I have not read before. So that one's going to go on. But Tina, I thank you for joining us. It's been a great conversation. I think we probably could have done this for another hour, quite honestly, and just gone through it. But I really appreciate you sharing your insights with the audience.
Well, I'm glad to have had the talk, and thanks for chasing me down and following me.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. As always, the views expressed are those of the individuals participating and not those of RealPage.